Handling authentications, if you're doing JSON Web Tokens, if you're doing encryptions on every route, can quickly become overwhelming. Let's take a look at a technique that we can use on the server side to be able to simplify this requirement. I'm going to go ahead and move to the code that we have on the server that I'll use for this demo. And as you can see here at the top of the page, I am requiring a number of Node.js modules. The first one is Express. That's the web framework, the popular web framework for Node.js. Then I am requiring the package for web tokens, as well as bcrypt encryption and universally unique identifiers. Now, if we scroll down to line 19, here's the functionality that I mentioned, the grouping of functionality that we can use for certain routes. And what we're going to do is we're going to define two broad categories. One of them is going to be an open set of routes, and the other one that requires authentication. And as you can see here, we put both of those under a router called API. So once we define all of these, then we can put under the API, the open and the auth, and put both of those directly on the Express app, as you can see there on line 25. Now, for the ones that will require authentication, we add a function using the pre-built auth.use for the router. That means that every single time we go down the set of routes, this will be required and it will execute before anything else. So what we can see here is the very first step of it is simply inspecting what kind of request, and this is for debugging purposes, so you can see on the console what kind of request is being made, as well as the path that is being requested, as well as the body payload. The next one is simply a quirk of the library that we're going to use on the client side that it requires you to add this option, this conditional statement. After that, if we are dealing with a get or a post, we then extract the information that we will be presenting from the client, from the web browser, and that is the user ID and the token that they are presenting. Now, the reason we have two blocks here is that we're looking at the case where a post is being done, and then subsequently, if that information is not found, then we consider the get case. That's HTTP post and HTTP get. Once that information is been extracted, we then look in our own local database or data store here, what if the user that is being posted is in fact part of our data store. If we do find it, then we go into this conditional statement. As you can see here, we then verify the JSON Web Token, we write to the console the decoded information, and we verify that the credentials that have been presented are in fact matching that which we have decoded. Else, we write an error back to the user, and this conditional here in the case where a user was not found creates the same error message. Now, once we've done this, then we can simplify our routes considerably. If you consider the case scrolling down the page where we look at a protected route, this will simply require us to now do auth.post in any route that we want to protect. For example, the one below where we're considering the case of get, where we do auth.get. That's all we need to do. We don't need to think about the authentication, about the tokens, about the encryption, because all of that was handled beforehand. At this case, we simply, if we've reached this point, that means that the authentication has been successful and we can simply proceed to work with the information that was presented. So let's go ahead and take a look at the client and what will be posted, and then we can go ahead and inspect the functionality with the console that writes on the server at the console. Before I get started, the client pages will be served up by, let me go ahead and show you as well that I have two folders here. One of them has the client code that will run on the server. Sorry, the client code will run on the browser, and then the other one is the server folder, which will run on Node.js. So as you can see here, this is the client path, and I'm simply going to run a simple HTTP server. that starts to listen on port 8080. Then I have the same thing on the server side, but this one runs, as I mentioned, on Node.js. So I enter node, and I will enter index.js, and I will start that, and that listens on port 3000. So let's go ahead and move back to the browser, and let's go ahead and navigate to the login page first. And as you can see there, we get a page with a couple of fields that will ask us for an email and a password. In this case, I will enter peter@mit.edu, and I will enter the password. And I will click on login. This will generate, if it's successful, cookies that will be placed within the browser. And yes, as you can see, the information that we got back is the token and then the user ID. If we look at the application information, you can see there that we now have a token and we have a user ID. So let's go ahead and navigate to the protected page. And I believe this one is a protected post. If you remember from our server-side code, we have a protected post, which is this one. And we're going to go ahead and post this information back to the server. Before we do that, let's go ahead and take a look at what that code is. I'm going to go ahead and open that up in the client, and as you can see here is the protected post. As you can see there, we have a single button. We have a couple libraries. One of them will simplify the posting we do to the server. The other one reads the cookies. Then after that, we have a single button that calls a function, which is password protected. Once we start in the function, you can see there that the very first thing we do is that we write down the endpoint, and note that the routes, encapsulations, and groupings impact the path that you're going to navigate. So the grouping was put into API. After that, we're going to follow the authenticated routes or router, and then the protected method. Once we read the information from the cookies, as you can see here, we create a user object. We write it to the console simply for inspection, and then we write our information for the posting to the server. The post URL is the information we just looked at. We will be sending the user object that we just created, and then we handle two cases. The first one is an error when we're unsuccessful and we go to the first conditional statement. The second one is a response if everything went well. So let's go ahead then and post that information. Let me go ahead and show you here that we have the cookies, as I mentioned, and we're now going to post to the protected route. So let's go ahead and do that. And as you can see there, we received the information back from the server. Everything was handled with those routes that we just defined. And if we take a look at the console, we can see that all of that information was being written out as well. If we go back to the code and review, remember at the very top of the server, we created those groupings of functionalities. We created an API. Then to the API, we added open and authenticated routes. Then we added a function to be used in the authenticated routes. And so this authentication here gets requested every single time. If I were to remove the cookies here and I tested the route again, you can see here that the post has failed because we're not presenting the right credentials anymore. Unauthorized route. So with that, I'll go ahead and close.